Imagine waking before dawn on a cold Scottish hillside. There's no alarm, no village bell, only the sound of wind. The low bleating of sheep and the faint jingle of tiny iron bells lost somewhere in the mist. Your hands are rough, your breath is visible in the morning air, and before you stretches a world of endless heather and silence. You are a shepherd, not a noble, not a knight, but one of the countless unseen people who kept medieval Scotland alive, one quiet day at a time tonight. We'll travel back to that forgotten world, a world of plaid cloaks and peat fires, of loyal dogs and long nights under the stars. This is not a story of kings or wars, but of patience, solitude, and the slow rhythm of survival, so settle in. Let your thoughts wander with the mist, and drift through the shepherd's life in medieval Scotland, real history and daily routine. If you were to stand on a high ridge in medieval Scotland, sometime around the year 1250, just before dawn, the world would feel suspended in gray silence. The wind would slide quietly across the moors, bending the heather and carrying the faint, rhythmic sound of bells. Those bells marked the beginning of another day in the life of a shepherd, one of the most common and least recorded figures of the Middle Ages. He was neither noble nor poor in spirit, though he might have owned little more than his crook, his dog, and his plaid. Yet his work touched nearly every aspect of Scottish society, trade, economy, survival, and the rhythm of rural existence. The shepherd's world was slow-moving and quiet, a place where the day began with cold fingers and ended with tired feet. His home, if it could be called that, was a low croft built of stone and turf, its roof sealed with sod or thatch, often shared with animals in the harsh months. There was no luxury, only necessity. The croft smelled of smoke, wool, and damp earth, and the hearth was the center of everything. A fire kept alive through habit as much as through skill. Each morning, often before the first light touched the hills, he stirred. There was no alarm, only the internal rhythm of duty and weather. The first act of the day was always observation. Shepherds learned to read the air as others read scripture. The direction of the wind, the color of the clouds, and the scent of the grass all mattered. A red glow in the eastern sky might warn of storms. Mist rolling down the valley meant cold rain before midday. The behavior of sheep, too, foretold the weather. If they huddled close, the shepherd read danger in the air. If they spread far apart, he knew the day would be calm. Before setting out, he wrapped himself in his plaid, a thick woven blanket of wool, long before tartans carried clan patterns or colors. This garment served as both coat and bed, as cloak against wind and pillow at night. Around his waist he tied a leather belt that held a simple knife and a small pouch for oatcakes or cheese. His staff or crook was carved from ash or hazel, bent at the top for hooking stray lambs or guiding sheep along narrow paths. The shepherd's dog, usually one of the early collie breeds, waited outside the door, eyes bright and tail still. The two creatures shared a language without words. The dog knew his master's habits, and the shepherd trusted his dog's instincts more than any written instruction. Together, they set off across the moors. Medieval Scotland's hills and glens were open, unenclosed landscapes. There were no fences, only natural boundaries, streams, rock ridges, and tradition. Sheep grazed freely on common or monastery-owned land. The shepherd's job was to know precisely where the flock might wander and how far was too far. Each valley and slope had its rhythm, each outcropping of rock its pattern of shade and wind. He knew them all by memory, as surely as a sailor knows the sea. The sheep themselves were small and hardy, nothing like the plump, wool-heavy breeds of today. They carried thick coats of rough, oily wool that resisted rain and wind. These early Scottish sheep were often descendants of the Soay or Dunfus breeds, compact, with spiral horns and a wary temperament. They were as stubborn as the land itself, and the shepherd's skill lay not in overpowering them, but in understanding their moods. When the morning sun finally broke through the mist, the landscape came alive with subtle movement, white dots shifting among the purple heather, the occasional bark of a dog echoing across the slope, the ring of bells marking the rhythm of the day. Bells were not a novelty. They were Tool's small bronze or iron clappers tied to the necks of sheep to make them audible in fog. To a shepherd's trained ear, every bell had its tone. The flock was a symphony of metal and wool, and silence was its warning note. Counting the sheep was the first great ritual of the day. This was done not with written numbers, for literacy was rare, but with memory, rhythm, and rhyme. Some shepherds used small stones, passing one from hand to hand for each animal. Others recited counting songs in Scots or Gaelic, ancient sequences of nonsense words that kept the rhythm steady. Yan, tan, tethra, methra. Pimp, an old Celtic counting rhyme that survived for centuries in rural Britain. Each number had its sound, each sound its comfort. Once the flock was accounted for, the shepherd watched. That was his work, to watch. It was not idleness, though from afar it might seem so. Watching was both survival and art. It meant noticing which away strayed too far, which lamb limped, which cloud darkened the western edge of the sky. It meant reading the silence between sounds. The shepherd spent hours like this, motionless except for the movement of his eyes and the occasional call to his dog. The dog's name might be something simple Glenn, Mac, or Bairn, but his role was essential. Trained through years of repetition, the dog understood whistles, clicks, and gestures. A sharp whistle sent him running wide to the left, another to the right. A click of the tongue slowed him, a low hum told him to hold. In moments of danger, he was the shepherd's first line of defense. Against wolves, thieves, or storms, the dog's loyalty was absolute. Travelers who crossed the highlands spoke of shepherds and their dogs as if they shared one soul between them. By midday, when the light grew softer and the wind steadied, the shepherd might sit upon a stone, unwrap his food, and eat in silence. A piece of oatcake, a chunk of cheese, perhaps a sip of ale, nothing more. The sheep grazed around him, and the dog lay at his feet. Sometimes he would hum a psalm or recite a prayer. Other times he would listen to the earth, the distant cry of an eagle, the murmur of a stream, the low chatter of sheep. The Scottish shepherd was rarely alone in spirit, though he might not see another human for days. The land itself was his companion. He spoke to it in habit and respect, often invoking God or the saints for protection. The Virgin Mary was a common presence in his muttered prayers, and Saint Cuthbert, known for his love of animals, was often regarded as a silent guardian of flocks. Religious life was simple, built into daily work rather than apart from it. In many places, shepherds worked for monasteries. The great abbeys of Melrose, Jedburgh, and Kelso owned thousands of sheep during the 12th and 13th centuries, forming the backbone of Scotland's wool trade. The wool gathered from these remote highlands was carried to ports like Berwick or Leith, shipped across the North Sea to Bruges and Flanders, and woven into cloth that clothed merchants and knights. It was a quiet empire of fleece, and the shepherd half peasant, half craftsman stood at its base, yet the shepherd's life remained largely invisible. His name rarely appeared in records. At best, he might be listed in a monastery account book. To the herder of Tweed, 2 marks for the keeping of 180 sheep. If sheep were lost, the shepherd bore the fine. If they thrived, the credit went to his master. Still he endured. The afternoons passed with small labors. The shepherd checked for signs of foot rot or fly strike, trimmed hooves with a knife, or marked lambs with soot or colored dye. He mended simple fences or stacked stones to build new folds. His movements were slow, deliberate, and repetitive, the kind that made hours dissolve. When the sun began to dip, the work turned to sword gathering. The gathering of sheep was a ritual of noise and movement. The shepherd's whistle echoed, and the dogs sprang into motion, circling wide, barking sharp. Sheep moved like a tide across the moor, hesitant but compelled. Dust rose, bells clanged, and a line of white forms merged toward the low pen or fold where they would rest for the night. Once inside, the shepherd counted again, this time in the dim light of dusk, his lips moving silently. When the day's labors ended, the shepherd built a fire from peat and dry brush. The smell of burning peat was thick and earthy, clinging to his clothes and hair. He sat close, warming his hands. The dog curled nearby, half asleep but alert. The world around them grew dark, the hills turning from green to gray, and the stars began to appear. Nights were long in the highlands, especially in winter. The shepherd often stayed awake for much of it, tending the fire and listening for trouble. Wolves still roamed parts of Scotland well into the late medieval period, and stories of their raids passed from generation to generation. A wolf could decimate a flock in minutes. Bells, dogs, and firelight were the only defense. The shepherd's ear, attuned to every sound, caught the difference between a sheep shifting in sleep and a predator's tread on wet earth. Sometimes, other dangers came: thieves or desperate men from neighboring valleys, seeking to steal livestock. In such cases, the shepherd relied on his dogs, his crook, and his voice. A shout could carry far across the still night, summoning aid from another watchman. Most nights, however, passed without violence. They were filled instead with silence, the hiss of the fire, the slow breathing of sheep, and the occasional moan of wind through the rocks. In that silence, the shepherd's mind often wandered. He might think of home, of his wife or children in the village below, or of the seasons that marked the passing years. The lambing in spring, the shearing in summer, the long bleak months of winter. He lived in cycles, not dates. Time for him was measured by weather, by growth of wool, by the births and deaths of animals. His hands were always rough, his face weathered by wind. His speech carried the soft vowels of the Scots tongue, mixed with older Gaelic words that lingered in the hills. He was not a man of politics or war, though those forces shaped his world from afar. When kings fought or abbots quarreled, it was his sheep that paid the price, driven off, taxed, or taken as spoils. Yet the shepherd endured these changes with the same stoic patience he showed to the weather. There was beauty in his life, though it was a quiet beauty. The sight of the sunrise over mist-covered glens, the first cry of a newborn lamb, the warmth of a plaid after a long night. These were not grand things, but they were enough. His world was small but complete, and in its simplicity lay a kind of peace. Shepherds, over generations, became keepers of stories as well as sheep. They told tales to pass the time of saints who guarded flocks, of fairies who lured lambs into the mist, of ghostly dogs that walked the hills at night. These stories, half warning and half wonder, gave shape to the unknown. When the wind howled or lights flickered in the distance, it was easier to believe in spirits than in chance. Their songs were equally enduring. Many old Scottish ballads, though later written by poets, may have begun as shepherds' songs, melancholy tunes hummed to the rhythm of walking, herding, or waiting. The repetition of words mirrored the repetition of life, each verse returning like the turning of seasons. By the time winter came, the shepherd's labor grew harder. Snow covered the hills, and the sheep were driven to lower ground. Fires had to be kept burning, shelters reinforced. The plaid grew heavier with frost. Yet still, the shepherd went out each day, driven by necessity and the quiet obligation that came with his calling. In such months, food was scarce. The shepherd ate what he could: barley broth, oat porridge, or dried fish if fortune allowed. The dog shared what little there was. There were moments of companionship, too. Sometimes shepherds from neighboring valleys met at boundary lines to exchange words, count strays, or share a drink. These brief gatherings broke the solitude. They discussed weather, births, deaths, and trade. A lost sheep might be returned, or one found might be claimed. There were no written contracts, only memory and trust. When spring returned, the work changed again. Lambing season brought sleepless nights and careful tending. The shepherd helped deliver young, kept fires lit for warmth, and guarded against foxes and crows. The moors filled with the bleating of newborns and the scent of new grass. Life renewed itself in the same quiet way it always had. Through all of it, the shepherd's place remained humble yet essential. His work supported the cloth that clothed kings and clergy, the wool that filled merchant coffers, and the rhythm that tied human life to the land. He asked for little in return: a dry shelter, a loyal dog, and peace enough to endure. By the 15th century, the wool trade had reshaped much of Scotland's rural life. Monastic lands expanded, sheep replaced crops in many valleys, and shepherds became more numerous. Yet their existence remained largely unchanged. The tools were the same, the routines identical. Even as the world beyond grew restless with wars and alliances, the shepherd's life held steady, as if time itself had slowed upon the hills. And when the shepherd grew old, his hair turned gray, his joints stiffened by cold, he often stayed where he had always been. Younger men might take over the flock, but the old shepherd remained as a watcher still, teaching the next generation how to read the clouds, how to count by rhythm, how to trust the dog more than one's own eyes. His knowledge was not written in books. It was passed by gesture and memory, from one pair of rough hands to another. In this way, the shepherd's legacy endured, woven quietly into Scotland's history like a thread of undyed wool, unnoticed, yet indispensable. The monasteries that once ruled the trade fell into ruin after the Reformation. The wolves disappeared, and the crofts became relics. But the image of the shepherd alone against the moor, watching over his flock, remained. It became a symbol of patience, faith, and the slow endurance of the land itself. If you visit those same hills today, you might still hear echoes of that life: the faint ringing of a bell, the bark of a collie, the sigh of wind through grass. Modern shepherds use fences and machines, but the rhythm is the same. They rise with the dawn, read the sky, trust their dogs, and live by the unspoken bond between man, animal, and earth. And perhaps, somewhere in the quiet moments between sunrise and dusk, they feel the same calm that their ancestors once did, a calm born not from ease, but from the steady repetition of small necessary acts. In the end, the shepherd's life in medieval Scotland was neither grand nor tragic. It was simple, honest, and enduring. A life of watching, waiting, and caring. A life measured not in achievements, but in survival. It was a history without heroes, yet it shaped the land more deeply than any battle or crown. The shepherd stood as a bridge between wildness and civilization, between solitude and society. His world was small, but within it lay the vastness of patience, the quiet, steadfast rhythm of a man and his flock beneath the endless Scottish sky. And so, if you listen closely, you might still hear him in the distance, the soft jingle of a bell, the whisper of wool against heather, the steady breath of one who has watched over the same hills for 1,000 years. And that's the end of tonight's quiet journey through the hills of medieval Scotland. If you've made it this far, maybe half asleep, maybe still listening to the sound of the wind in your mind, thank you for spending your time here. In this slow corner of history, these calm stories are what we do every night here on Quiet, Boring Sleep, Gentle History. Told slowly for resting minds. If you enjoyed this peaceful wander through the past, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this small, sleepy space grow, and it lets me keep bringing you more forgotten, quiet corners of history to drift away to. Until next time, rest well, dream softly, and may your night be as still as the shepherd's hills.